So for those on the spiritual path, there's a deep longing, a sincere longing to know true nature. There's a sense that something essential about who we are hasn't yet been fully recognized. We could call this the longing to come home, the longing to know truth, the longing to be free. There's an intuition that something about our essential nature is free, and yet we don't feel free. And so the search takes us through on a journey. And sometimes with many twists and turns. We read books, spiritual books, we meditate, we explore many teachings, many traditions. Whichever road we take, there's something behind all that. There's the hope that one day I will awaken. That's the conscious or unconscious carrot that's dangled. One day I will be free. One day I will awaken. One day I will be enlightened. When that hope, when that internal narrative, conversation, whether it's been brought to light or not, whether it's been examined or not, remains somewhat unexamined, it covers up an assumption that is, in fact, an obstacle to that which we seek. And the assumption is that the one who is seeking, the person that we believe ourselves to be, will eventually become enlightened. That somehow this me, with my history, my personality, my identity, will transform into an awakened being. And that idea of the me becoming an awakened being is the solution. And so a lot of the search is geared towards that, whether we know it or don't know it. But this assumption that it's the self that awakens, which runs so deep in many seekers, in most seekers, and even in many traditions that seem to perpetuate this myth, needs to be questioned within ourselves, not as a conceptual idea, but within ourselves, within each of us, within each individual. Is it the self that becomes awakened? And direct inquiries through the contemplation, guided meditation we just were involved in are a pointer to the recognition that the sense of separate self is in fact illusory, whilst very real within a certain paradigm of perception if you look within, it doesn't actually exist. When awakening actually reveals itself, whether it's in a glimpse or an abiding awakening, it's very clear that it's not the self that awakens. The self, what we call the self, is a construct made up of memories, experiences, conditioning. It becomes the story of who we are. That story is not in itself a problem, because it allows us to function in the world. It allows us to communicate, to navigate, to play our roles. But when it comes to realizing true nature, the self, the functioning self, becomes the center. And that center, whilst it's functional, is an impediment, because it's not that center that awakens. It's that center, that sense of self, that sense of separate self, and the belief that I am that this is who I am, that stands in the way, that obscures the awake, aware presence that is already here. That which is aware is not the separate self. The separate self is a construct, psychological construct. That which is aware is awareness itself. And awareness doesn't need to awaken. Awareness doesn't become enlightened. Awareness doesn't become free. Awareness is already awake, already present, already the light of being. It doesn't need to become anything. It doesn't need to become enlightened. It's only the belief in being a separate self that creates the appearance that awakening is needed in order to be free. So, direct looking, if you like, direct observation, direct inquiry, to look at what is appearing, is the primary doorway. Yeah, we see that there are thoughts, we see there are sensations, we see there are emotions. But when we try to look for the one that is seeing, for the one that is experiencing, we cannot locate that. We cannot find that other than a construct, a self-belief that it's the me that's experiencing this. If we look deeper, there is no me except on the functional level. It is not the me that is perceiving. It is not the me that is feeling. It is awareness itself. Only awareness can be aware of experience. So awakening isn't something that happens to you. It doesn't happen to the person. Awakening is the recognition of what has always been here. It's awareness recognizing itself. And that recognition becomes glaringly obvious when what falls away is the belief that the self, the separate self, the sense of me, is the one at the center of all this. So it's not that a sudden special state happens to the individual. Nothing new is gained. Nothing is added to you. What falls away is the misunderstanding that the separate self, or the sense of separate self, is the one who needs to awaken, or the one that is experiencing life. It's like the prison that we think we are in, that the separate self thinks and feels it's in, and therefore wants to awaken out of that. The prison is seen to be an illusion. The prison bars were never there. They were only believed. And this is a radical shift in perception and shift in recognition. The reason it has a seeming impact on the individual life and the individual experience is that it sort of pulls the rug out. It pulls the whole platform upon which the separate self thought it was standing. It reorientates, it restructures. And that's what feels, wow, that's what feels mind-blowing. That in itself is not awakening. That's not the awakening. That's the restructuring. So, in that recognition, should it be recognized that there is no self that needs to awaken? Again, this mustn't remain as just an idea. This takes time to look within. But should that recognition reveal itself to you, then seeking comes to an end. The whole search for something special comes to an end. That doesn't mean that we fall back into habitual ways. It simply means that we become more available for the deeper truths that are available in pointers to that which is true, that which is direct experience. Because there is a kind of restructuring or rearrangement that goes on. We could call that the embodiment of that. The embodiment of that open, naked field of awareness, whilst it's already here, as the whole structure of the separate self-identity comes undone. That realization has to then filter into the lived experience. And that's where ongoing inquiry allows us to stabilize in that. And that's different to the seeker who's seeking enlightenment. That's the humility and courage to allow a deepening of that realization, a kind of purification that takes place, because the self, the habitual patterns of the self may still want to come in and take ownership of experience. But somehow there's a turning point from being the seeker seeking for some end result, seeking for some special state. And there's a shift from that to simply being the one who is living the truth and open to a deepening of that living of the truth.